She opened the door and froze, her husband in bed with 3 male slaves, and in that instant, Eleanor realized the darkest secret of the entire town was about to be exposed. The morning began like any other on the sprawling plantation, the sun rising over the endless fields in hues of amber and gold, casting long shadows across the cotton rows and slave quarters. The air was thick with the scent of earth, sweat, and the faint sweetness of blooming flowers, a deceptive calm masking the storm that was about to break. Eleanor walked through the main hall of the mansion, her steps echoing faintly against the polished wooden floors. She carried herself with the grace expected of the plantation's mistress, but beneath that exterior, a gnawing unease had settled in her chest over the past weeks. There had been whispers, fleeting glimpses, rumors that brushed past her ears like shadows, but she had dismissed them, telling herself that the stability of her life and her family must never be disturbed. Yet that morning, something invisible pushed her toward the master's private quarters, a sense, almost primal, that she needed to see for herself the truth that had been hiding in plain sight. The door to his room was slightly ajar, and Eleanor's breath caught in her throat as she paused at the threshold. The smell of expensive cologne mingled with something darker, more pungent, a scent that made her stomach churn. Through the narrow opening she saw him, her husband, the man whose smile had once seemed so charming, now a grotesque figure of indulgence and cruelty. He was surrounded by 3 male slaves, each one bound not by rope, but by the power imbalance that had been enforced over years of fear and obedience. Their expressions were a mixture of shock, resignation, and silent pleading, the kind that only comes when a person has learned the impossibility of escape. Eleanor's eyes widened, her hands trembling as the scene etched itself into her memory with horrifying clarity. The betrayal was intimate, personal, and public, in a way that words could scarcely capture. Her chest tightened, the betrayal a physical ache that made it difficult to breathe. She wanted to scream, to run, to demand explanations, but a deep, icy calm settled over her, rooted in a clarity that came only from witnessing undeniable truth. This was not a moment for private confrontation, nor for quiet despair. The magnitude of what she had uncovered demanded visibility, demanded that the world see the corruption and abuse for what it truly was. Her husband's casual arrogance, the way he had treated the men as nothing more than objects for his pleasure, fueled a fire inside her that she had never known. The betrayal was not only sexual, it was moral, societal, and deeply personal. Every lie he had told, every promise he had broken, every night spent pretending to be a man of honor, now lay exposed in the morning light, a tableau of shame that could no longer be hidden. Eleanor stepped closer, her mind racing with plans and possibilities. She had learned, over years of navigating the rigid hierarchy of plantation life, how to manipulate attention and perception. She knew that confronting him in the bedroom, in the intimacy of secrecy, would allow him to manipulate the story, to gaslight and dismiss her. No, this needed to be public, undeniable, and devastating. As she quietly closed the door behind her, careful to make no noise, her mind moved through the town, envisioning the people she would enlist, the faces that would witness, the collective shock that would amplify the weight of his crimes. She thought of the neighbors, the servants, even the distant townsfolk who had always bowed politely to his wealth and influence. They would all see him stripped of pretense, forced to face the consequence of every abuse, every act of arrogance that had been shielded by his power. The world outside continued in oblivion, the distant calls of workers and the rhythmic clatter of tools on soil, a cruel contrast to the revelation she had just uncovered. Eleanor paused in the hallway, her hand brushing against the banister, grounding herself as the first flush of adrenaline coursed through her veins. She could still see the fear in the slaves' eyes, a silent plea that they, too, might find justice in the coming hours. Her mind flicked to the years of oppression, the years of silenced suffering that had been ignored under the veneer of wealth and civility. Every act of cruelty he had committed, every humiliation inflicted under the guise of discipline, now converged into a single point of clarity: he must be held accountable, and no one, not the powerful, not the complacent, must look away. She moved silently through the halls, her footsteps deliberate, as if the mansion itself acknowledged the gravity of her mission. Each room she passed felt heavier, saturated with the secrets it had silently witnessed over decades. The portraits of ancestors on the walls seemed to watch her, their painted eyes reflecting approval, judgment, and silent admonition. Eleanor felt the weight of history pressing against her chest, a reminder that power had always been abused in these halls, that cruelty had long thrived in silence. But today, she thought, it would not. Today, she would turn the tables, harnessing the moral outrage of a community that had long been lulled into submission. Today, her husband would be forced to confront not only his actions, but the collective gaze of those he had believed he could dominate, and silence. As she reached the main staircase, Eleanor's pulse quickened. The light streaming through the high windows illuminated the dust motes floating lazily in the air, creating a surreal, almost cinematic haze around her. Each step downward felt like a descent into the very heart of reckoning. She envisioned the town gathering, the faces of the workers, their expressions a mixture of curiosity, fear, and anticipation. Her husband's power was formidable, but it had always been dependent on secrecy, on the illusion of control. Once exposed, she knew it would crumble like dry clay under relentless scrutiny. Eleanor allowed herself a brief, private shiver of satisfaction, not for the pain he would face, but for the truth that would finally see the light. The weight of years of betrayal pressed against her, and for the first time she felt a kind of liberation in her anger, a moral clarity that steadied her steps and hardened her resolve. The journey to confront him publicly required more than courage. It demanded precision, timing, and an understanding of human psychology that Eleanor had honed through years of navigating the rigid social structures around her. She paused briefly in the foyer, collecting herself, her reflection in the grand mirror staring back with wide, determined eyes. This was a woman transformed, a witness to betrayal who would not allow the abuse of power to persist unchecked. Eleanor envisioned the scene she would create, each detail meticulously planned. The words she would speak, the expressions she would draw from the crowd, the undeniable exposure that would leave him powerless and shamed. In her mind, the entire town became an audience, and the plantation itself a stage set for the most dramatic confrontation they would ever witness. She could feel the electricity in the air, the way it charged her muscles and sharpened her mind. Every heartbeat, every breath was in perfect rhythm with the storm she was about to unleash. And yet, despite the clarity and precision forming in her mind, Eleanor could not escape the ache in her chest, the deep personal grief that accompanied betrayal of this magnitude. Love had been corrupted, trust destroyed, and the foundation of her life shattered in a single moment of exposure. But grief, she realized, could be harnessed as power. It could fuel her actions, sharpen her resolve, and lend her a voice that could no longer be ignored. As she walked toward the door leading to the outside world, she cast one last glance at the shadowed room where the betrayal had been laid bare. The image of her husband, his arrogance now tinged with fear, and the subdued, trembling forms of the slaves would remain with her forever, a visual reminder of the consequences of unchecked power. She exhaled slowly, allowing the weight of both sorrow and determination to settle within her, transforming despair into a weapon that would pierce the veil of secrecy. By the time Eleanor stepped out into the open morn, the world outside had begun to stir more fully, the workers moving in rhythmic patterns through the fields, the distant sound of a carriage on the main road, the rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze. But Eleanor's presence, her intent, and her knowledge of the unthinkable secret shifted the energy of the plantation in an imperceptible but undeniable way. Something primal and elemental had awakened in her, a fierce, unwavering drive to bring justice, to expose the darkness lurking behind wealth and social standing. She would become the arbiter, the witness, and the catalyst for change. Every eye that would soon turn toward the mansion would see not just a scandal, but a reckoning decades in the making. And Eleanor knew with absolute certainty that nothing would ever be the same again. The first act of defiance had begun, and the morning sun shone on a world that was about to be forever altered. Eleanor's mind raced as she stepped out of the shadowed hallways of the mansion into the soft morning light. The plantation seemed impossibly calm, a cruel juxtaposition to the storm that had erupted in her heart. Every step she took across the polished wooden floors was deliberate, purposeful, each echo a quiet drumbeat of impending reckoning. She understood that what she had seen, her husband entangled in betrayal and abuse, could not remain a secret. It could not be contained behind closed doors. Secrets, she had learned over the years, were weapons of power, and those who wielded them unopposed often grew stronger. But today, Eleanor would turn secrecy against him. She would make the hidden visible, the forbidden undeniable. She began with the servants, her first audience and unlikely allies in this perilous task. In the kitchen, the cooks paused mid-chop, sensing something different in her demeanor. Her voice was calm but carried an authority that brooked no denial. She recounted, not with hysteria, but with precision, the scene she had witnessed, the betrayal, the abuse, the arrogance that her husband had wielded like a sword against those powerless to resist. She described the fear in the eyes of the men, the silent pleas for intervention that had gone unanswered for years. The servants listened in stunned silence, their expressions a mixture of horror, disbelief, and a growing ember of hope. For the first time, someone was acknowledging what they had long suspected but had been too afraid to confront. Eleanor did not linger, sensing that fear alone would not catalyze change. She moved from room to room, her words leaving invisible but indelible marks on those who heard them. By mid-morning, Eleanor had reached the quarters where the workers, slaves and overseers alike, performed their grueling labor. The rhythm of their work slowed as her presence drew their attention. She spoke openly, naming names, recounting details that could no longer be ignored. At first there were whispers, hushed exchanges as disbelief wrestled with the dawning realization of truth. The plantation had always seemed like a microcosm of control, a system where power flowed from master to laborer, unchecked and absolute. But Eleanor was cracking the foundation, introducing a seed of doubt that grew quickly into outrage. Some looked at her with cautious fear, uncertain whether her words were a trap, while others felt a surge of courage, the first spark of rebellion igniting in their chests. Eleanor recognized the risk in exposing such truths, but she also understood that collective awareness was the only path to justice. The message spread like wildfire, carried on cautious voices and anxious glances. Eleanor had become an unwilling herald of truth, her calm resolve amplifying the gravity of the revelation. Word reached the neighboring estates, whispered along fences, through fields, and across dusty paths where children played unaware of the dark forces shaping their world. By midday, the town itself seemed to vibrate with tension, as if the very air carried the weight of Eleanor's revelation. Housewives paused in their chores, merchants lowered their shutters for a moment of disbelief, and strangers on the streets whispered to one another, trying to make sense of the scandal that had erupted in the heart of the plantation. Eleanor moved with purpose, her eyes scanning every face she passed, noting reactions and silently gauging who would stand with her, who might falter under pressure, and who could be swayed by the irresistible force of truth. In the fields, where the slaves bent under the relentless sun, Eleanor's presence drew cautious attention. Men and women paused, their tools suspended mid-air, as if sensing that the rhythm of labor had been interrupted by forces beyond their comprehension. She spoke with deliberate clarity, recounting the betrayal not as scandal, but as a moral imperative, a call to witness that demanded recognition. The slave's eyes widened as the reality of her words settled in, disbelief mingling with a tentative hope that the woman who had been complicit in their silence for years was now their champion. For the first time, they dared to imagine a world where their suffering might be acknowledged, where the cruelty that had shaped their lives could be challenged openly. Eleanor's calm determination acted as a catalyst, transforming fear into courage, despair into resolve, and silence into a chorus of attention. The power of witnessing became evident as the townspeople began to converge, drawn by the whispers, the urgent tones of Eleanor's message, and the invisible magnetism of truth. The distant hum of daily life faltered, replaced by the growing weight of anticipation. Children clutched at their mothers' skirts, eyes wide with curiosity. Men paused mid-task, faces etched with incredulity, and women, who had long been taught that their role was to observe quietly, now leaned forward, compelled to absorb every word. Eleanor understood that the spectacle was already forming, the collective gaze of an entire community converging on the truth that had been concealed for too long. Her strategy, born from necessity and courage, was unfolding perfectly. Each witness amplified the gravity of the moment, creating a feedback loop of attention, outrage, and moral scrutiny that her husband could no longer escape. Eleanor's mind worked with calculated precision, envisioning the steps required to ensure that the truth would not only be acknowledged, but absorbed with the full weight of moral consequence. She considered the sequence of revelations, the timing of witnesses, and the inevitable confrontation that would force the plantation owner to face the consequences of his actions. Her body remained calm, almost serene, but her thoughts churned like a storm-tossed sea. Every step, every word, every glance was deliberate, a meticulously choreographed dance of exposure. She had learned that the spectacle of truth required more than mere fact. It demanded tension, suspense, and the undeniable presence of witnesses whose gaze could no longer be ignored or deflected. She moved through the growing crowd, sensing the shift in energy, the collective heartbeat of a town that was awakening to the reality of abuse hidden in plain sight. As the crowd grew, Eleanor paused to observe the reactions of those she had reached first. The slaves, who had once been shadows in the background of her husband's life, now held their heads higher, their eyes no longer dulled by fear. They whispered among themselves a language of cautious hope, recognizing that Eleanor's intervention was the first step toward justice. The townspeople murmured, some incredulous, some outraged, as they processed the implications of her revelations. The plantation, which had always seemed an untouchable fortress of power, now felt permeable, vulnerable to the moral scrutiny that Eleanor had orchestrated. She felt a surge of satisfaction, tempered by the knowledge that the coming confrontation would be perilous. Her husband was clever, manipulative, and accustomed to controlling narratives, but Eleanor now held the ultimate weapon, truth, witnessed by the eyes of a town that could not look away. By afternoon, the energy around the mansion had reached a palpable intensity. The whispers had grown into conversations, conversations into debates, and debates into a tense, electric anticipation. Eleanor moved among the crowd, observing each face, noting the mixture of fear, curiosity, anger, and anticipation that played across their features. The slaves, once invisible, now became central figures in the moral reckoning that was unfolding. Eleanor's calm presence anchored the crowd, her words lending coherence and purpose to the emotional storm that had erupted in the hearts of all who had heard her revelations. Every person who had come to witness now understood the gravity of what was at stake, the abuse of power, the betrayal of trust, and the opportunity to participate in a collective act of justice that could no longer be postponed. Eleanor understood that the gathering of witnesses was more than mere spectacle. It was the embodiment of moral accountability. Each person present contributed to the weight of collective judgment, their attention acting as both shield and sword, protecting the innocent and striking at the guilty. She had transformed fear into agency, silence into testimony, and despair into resolve. The slave's eyes met hers in brief, fleeting moments, communicating gratitude, fear, and the fragile hope that their suffering would finally be recognized. The town's energy coalesced into a tense anticipation, each heartbeat synchronized with the inevitability of confrontation. Eleanor felt the magnitude of what she had set in motion, the sense that history itself was bending to witness this moment, recording it in memory and conscience alike. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the fields and mansion, the golden light illuminating the tense faces of the witnesses and the growing sense of inevitability that filled the air. Eleanor moved strategically among the crowd, guiding attention, shaping perception, and preparing the stage for the confrontation that would soon unfold. Every glance, every subtle gesture was designed to maximize impact, to ensure that her husband's misdeeds would not be dismissed, rationalized, or ignored. The truth had been released into the world, and it carried with it a weight that no wealth, charm, manipulation could counteract. Eleanor, standing amidst the gathering crowd, felt the surge of power that comes from harnessing justice, from being the conduit through which truth and accountability flow. She knew that the moment of reckoning was approaching, and with it the chance to reshape the destiny of the plantation, the town, and the lives that had been oppressed for far too long. By evening, the tension reached its peak. The crowd had grown to include nearly every able-bodied resident of the town, each person aware that they were about to witness an event that would forever alter the social and moral landscape. Eleanor stood at the center, a calm eye in the storm of whispers, fears, and anticipatory murmurs. Her mind was sharp, her purpose unyielding, and her heart steeled against both the danger and the emotional weight of what was to come. The slaves, once shadows of submission, now became living symbols of resilience, their presence a testament to the consequences of abuse and the inevitability of justice. Eleanor took a breath, feeling the pulse of the crowd as if it were her own heartbeat, and prepared to unleash the final act that would bring truth into full, unflinching light. The first act of public reckoning was poised to begin, and nothing could stop the force that she had awakened. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind of tension that makes the hairs on your arms stand at attention and the stomach tighten with nervous energy. Eleanor stood at the top of the mansion's grand steps, the wooden railing cold beneath her hands, yet her grip was steady, unwavering. Below her the crowd had gathered, a sea of faces turned toward the plantation house, each person sensing that the moment they were about to witness would mark the turning point in the history of their small, insular town. Mothers held their children close, men exchanged uneasy glances, and the slaves, who had long been hidden in the margins of power, now stood near the center, their eyes wide, their posture cautious but unbroken. Eleanor's heart pounded, not with fear for herself, but with the weight of the justice she was about to unleash. Every fiber of her being was focused on one objective: expose the man who had cloaked cruelty in charm and make the world bear witness. From the shadows of the mansion's doorway he emerged. The plantation owner, who had long been revered for his wealth and apparent dignity, stepped into the light, his expression one of calculated confidence. He had always been able to manipulate perception, to charm and deceive, but the moment he saw the crowd, the realization flickered in his eyes. The balance of power had shifted. The crowd's murmurs intensified as they recognized him, whispers of betrayal and disbelief spreading like wildfire. Eleanor's gaze locked onto his, her calm intensity piercing him in a way that no amount of arrogance could deflect. She could see the first cracks in the facade, the tiny tremors of panic that I a man used to absolute control. Her voice cut through the tension, firm and unyielding, as she recounted, with deliberate clarity, every detail of his transgressions. She spoke of the betrayal she had witnessed, the humiliation inflicted upon the men he had enslaved, and the moral corruption that had gone unchecked for far too long. Each word landed like a hammer on stone, each syllable a strike against the edifice of his arrogance. The crowd leaned forward collectively, caught in the gravity of her narrative, unable to turn away even as shock, horror, and disbelief rippled through them. Mothers clutched their children tighter, whispering prayers, while men's fists clenched as they struggled to reconcile the image of the man they had respected with the depravity Eleanor revealed. The plantation owner tried to speak, to justify himself, to twist the narrative into something that could protect him, but the weight of Eleanor's words, combined with the silent judgment of the crowd, rendered him powerless. Every attempt to speak was drowned out by the murmurs of outrage and the heavy tension of collective witnessing. The slaves, once invisible and silenced, now held their heads high, their presence a living testament to resilience in the face of years of subjugation. The sight of them standing firmly in the light, no longer shadows but witnesses, reinforced the magnitude of the moment. Eleanor's careful orchestration of the gathering had transformed fear into moral power, making it impossible for him to escape the reckoning. As Eleanor continued, her words painted a vivid picture of his abuses, detailing the cruelty inflicted not just on her own heart, but on the lives of those who had no voice. The audience gasped, some turned pale, others murmured among themselves, the shock giving way to a collective understanding. Justice could no longer be deferred. Eleanor's tone was measured, unwavering, each sentence designed to land with precision, to ensure that the full scope of his betrayal was absorbed by every eye and every mind in the crowd. This was more than mere accusation, it was an indictment, a moral excavation exposing the rot that had festered behind the grand facade of wealth and charm. The tension in the air became almost physical, pressing against the walls of the mansion, making the atmosphere tremble with anticipation. The plantation owner's face reddened, his composure crumbling as Eleanor's words continued to pierce through the layers of his arrogance. He attempted a laugh, a dismissive gesture, but it was hollow, brittle, and immediately rejected by the silent, unwavering gaze of the townspeople. Every look from the crowd acted like a blade, cutting through the illusions he had relied upon for decades. The sense of power shifting, of dominance being challenged, was almost palpable. It was as if the air itself had turned against him. Eleanor could feel the collective heartbeat of the crowd, the synchronous rhythm of anticipation, outrage, fueling her resolve and magnifying the impact of her words. Then came the most potent part of her revelation. She turned to the slaves, gesturing toward them as she described the years of suffering they had endured. The abuses inflicted not just as punishment, but as a tool of control and humiliation. Their silence had been enforced by fear, their visibility had been denied by custom. Now, in the brilliance of the public gaze, they were no longer shadows. Each man, each woman, became a living emblem of resilience and testimony, their presence lending undeniable credibility to her narrative. Eleanor's eyes swept over the audience, noting the expressions of disbelief, sorrow, and moral awakening. The townspeople were no longer passive observers. They had become participants in the reckoning, their collective attention a force of accountability more powerful than any law or decree could ever be. The plantation owner's voice finally broke through, shaky and defensive, attempting to twist the narrative to invoke charm and authority. But Eleanor anticipated each word. She responded calmly, systematically, cutting through every excuse, every misdirection, exposing the fragility of his justifications. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, shifting from shock to anger, their judgment solidifying into a tangible force that pressed upon him from every side. His face, once confident and imposing, now revealed panic and despair. Eleanor had succeeded in stripping away every layer of pretense, leaving him vulnerable, exposed, and utterly powerless. As the confrontation escalated, the energy in the air became almost unbearable. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch from the mansion's walls to the very hearts of the people gathered. Eleanor's presence was magnetic, her calm authority compelling attention, while her husband's faltering attempts at control became increasingly desperate and futile. Every whispered comment, every sideways glance amplified the impact of her words. The crowd hung on every syllable, the suspense unbearable as they witnessed the full moral collapse of a man who had believed himself untouchable. Eleanor then orchestrated the turning point of the confrontation, guiding the audience to see not only the acts of betrayal, but the deeper truth of systemic abuse. She highlighted how his wealth and influence had allowed him to manipulate, silence, and dominate, creating an illusion of control that had masked years of cruelty. Her words painted a picture so vivid that the crowd could feel the oppression, smell the fear, and see the humiliation endured by those who had been rendered invisible for so long. The moral weight of her revelations bore down on the audience, creating a collective sense of outrage and righteous indignation. Every heart beat faster, every breath was caught, as the crowd absorbed the enormity of the truth she unveiled. The plantation owner tried one final desperate gesture, raising his hands as if to demand silence, but Eleanor anticipated it. She paused, letting the silence hang, letting the gaze of hundreds of witnesses weigh upon him. The moment was cinematic, almost theatrical, the culmination of years of betrayal and secrecy laid bare, exposed to a public that refused to look away. Even the slaves, standing at the center of the moral storm, held their heads high, their dignity restored in the act of collective witnessing. The town itself seemed to hold its breath, the oppressive history of silence, fear, and submission broken in an instant by Eleanor's courage and unwavering resolve. With a final, deliberate sweep of her gaze across the assembly, Eleanor declared the truth fully, leaving no room for denial or manipulation. The crowd erupted, not in celebration, but in a thunderous acknowledgement of justice being served through exposure. Shouts of outrage, murmurs of disbelief, and gasps of horror mingled in the air, creating a charged, almost electric atmosphere. The plantation owner stood frozen, the enormity of his moral collapse reflected in every face around him. Eleanor's mission had been accomplished. She had transformed private betrayal into public accountability, orchestrated a confrontation that could not be ignored, and catalyzed a moral reckoning that would ripple through the town for years to come. As the sun dipped fully below the horizon, the shadows lengthened across the plantation grounds, highlighting the stark contrast between abused and power witnessed. Eleanor's voice, steady and commanding, remained the anchor amidst the chaos, ensuring that the narrative of justice, exposure, and moral accountability would not be lost. The slaves, once hidden in fear, now walked with dignity. The townspeople, once passive, now understood the weight of moral responsibility, and the plantation owner, once a figure of unchallenged authority, had been reduced to a man confronted by the undeniable truth of his actions. The scene, etched into memory like a living painting, became the defining moment of the plantation's history, a dramatic, cinematic confrontation that would echo long after the voices quieted and the crowd dispersed. Eleanor, standing amid the charged atmosphere, felt a mix of relief, sorrow, and grim satisfaction. The confrontation had been more than a spectacle. It had been a transformation, turning fear into courage, silence into testimony, and betrayal into public reckoning. She knew that the story would be retold, that the memory of this day would linger in every mind, a warning of the consequences of unchecked power and a testament to the courage required to expose it. And as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Eleanor understood that the hardest part, the moral collapse of a tyrant before the eyes of the witnesses, had been accomplished. The public confrontation, violent in its moral clarity, had set the stage for the final acts of justice yet to come. The sun had begun its slow descent, behind the horizon, casting long, jagged shadows across the plantation grounds, painting the fields in shades of amber and ash. The air carried a strange mixture of anticipation and dread, thick enough to taste, as if the earth itself had paused to witness what was about to unfold. Eleanor stood at the edge of the grand courtyard, her presence calm and commanding, yet beneath the surface a storm of emotion churned. The entire town had gathered, not in celebration, but as witnesses to a reckoning that would leave no heart untouched, no conscience unshaken. She could feel the collective gaze of hundreds pressing down, heavy and tangible, like the weight of history finally demanding accountability. The plantation owner, once untouchable, now stood at the center of it all, a man stripped not only of his dignity, but of the illusions that had allowed him to wield power unchecked for decades. The slaves, those who had suffered in silence for years, stood nearby. Their eyes, once dulled by fear, now burned with cautious intensity. Eleanor had arranged it so that their presence could not be ignored, that the town could see their humanity, their courage, and the moral outrage they had been denied for so long. Every footstep of hers across the stone courtyard echoed like a drumbeat of justice, each one measured, deliberate, signaling the start of a process that could not be reversed. The plantation owner shifted uncomfortably, the polished veneer of confidence cracking under the wig. Each of hundreds of accusing eyes, He tried to speak, to assert control, but the murmurs of the crowd swallowed his words, and Eleanor's steady gaze ensured he knew there would be no escape. The crowd was a mixture of emotions: fear, curiosity, outrage, disbelief, but Eleanor understood that every emotion served a purpose. The spectacle itself was a weapon, a way to ensure that the lesson of accountability was not lost, that the cruelty of unchecked power would be etched into memory. Mothers clutched their children tightly, their eyes wide with horror and fascination, while men who had once turned a blind eye now felt the burn of shame, recognizing complicity in the silence that had allowed such abuses to continue. The very air seemed alive, trembling with anticipation as Eleanor began to speak, her voice slicing through the tense hum of the crowd, delivering words both sharp and deliberate. She recounted the abuses once more, not in hushed whispers, but in a cadence designed to command attention. Every cruelty, every humiliation, every act of arrogance and indulgence was laid bare, not as accusation alone, but as a moral demonstration. Eleanor's tone was calm, almost clinical, but the moral gravity behind it made the air around her vibrate with tension. The townspeople listened, rapt, unable to tear their eyes away, as though the very act of listening was binding them to the truth of what had been done. Each pause, each deliberate glance toward the slaves, reminded them that the was not a story. They were witnessing justice being enacted in real time, a rare and terrifying thing in a world where the powerful often escaped consequence. The plantation owner's posture began to crumble. Once tall and imposing, he now seemed smaller, his arrogance stripped bare. Sweat glistened on his brow, not from the heat of the afternoon sun, but from the suffocating weight of collective judgment. Eleanor had carefully orchestrated the scene so that he could no longer hide behind excuses or charm. Every person present was a witness, every gaze a silent verdict. The slaves, once voiceless, now served as living reminders of the consequences of cruelty and abuse. Eleanor's eyes met theirs briefly, a flicker of solidarity, a shared understanding that justice could be public, deliberate, and unflinching. The moral force of this assembly was palpable, electric, and undeniable. Eleanor moved among the crowd slowly, deliberately, ensuring every person could witness the full scope of the punishment that was about to unfold. The plantation owner tried again to speak, to command the attention of the crowd, but the murmurs of outrage drowned him out, echoing across the courtyard like rolling thunder. His face, once the mask of arrogance and control, now displayed shock, panic, and a dawning comprehension of the enormity of his situation. Eleanor's calm authority contrasted starkly with his unraveling presence, underscoring the power dynamic that had shifted irreversibly. Ever? Why whisper? Every gasp from the crowd reinforced the inevitability of the reckoning, the unflinching moral judgment that had been summoned into the light. The first act of punishment began subtly, a symbolic gesture designed to strip away his dignity and force acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Eleanor instructed the overseers to remove his finely tailored coat, revealing the man beneath the facade of wealth and authority. The crowd murmured, and the slave's eyes reflected cautious satisfaction. The act was deliberate, ceremonial even, and it carried with it the gravity of centuries of oppression reversed for a fleeting moment in the clarity of public judgment. Each action was choreographed not to humiliate for spectacle alone, but to ensure that accountability was visible, undeniable, and resonant. Eleanor's strategy was flawless. The moral force of public scrutiny magnified every gesture, every word, every expression of the plantation owner's unraveling composure. The punishment escalated. He was made to face the slaves, the very men whose lives he had demeaned and dominated, and the town watched as the power dynamic that had defined the plantation for decades reversed in slow, deliberate motion. Eleanor guided the narrative with precision, ensuring that each witness understood the moral clarity of the moment. The men who had suffered in silence now had the opportunity, if only symbolically, to assert their presence, to claim visibility and recognition. The town, previously passive observers of cruelty, now witnessed the human consequences of unchecked power. Their collective gaze acted as both judgment and safeguard, ensuring that the abuses of the past could not be ignored, rationalized, or repeated. The sun continued its descent, casting long, skeletal shadows across the courtyard, the fading light creating a cinematic backdrop for the unfolding justice. Eleanor remained the calm eye in the storm, her presence commanding, unshakable, while the plantation owner struggled under the weight of exposure, accountability, and moral collapse. The crowd leaned forward collectively, their attention unwavering, every member acutely aware that they were participating in something rare and transformative. Eleanor had orchestrated more than punishment. She had created a living, breathing example of justice, an undeniable demonstration of consequence that would ripple through the town and plantation for generations. As the shadows lengthened, Eleanor delivered her final, decisive address. Her voice was steady but carried the weight of moral authority, recounting not just the personal betrayal she had witnessed, but the broader implications of unchecked cruelty and systemic oppression. The crowd listened, rapt and silent, as the plantation owner's defenses crumbled completely. The moral collapse was total. His arrogance, his power, his illusions of control, all reduced to nothing in the clear light of public judgment. Eleanor's careful orchestration ensured that each member of the audience understood the enormity of his transgressions and the transformative power of accountability. The final act of punishment was not physical alone, but symbolic, psychological, and intensely public. Eleanor arranged for him to perform a series of tasks previously reserved for the lowest-ranking workers, forcing him to confront the reality of labor and submission he had once treated with disdain. The crowd's murmurs of shock and awe underscored the gravity of the reversal. The slaves observed with quiet satisfaction, their dignity restored in the act of witnessing and reclaiming the moral authority that had long been denied to them. Eleanor's eyes scanned the crowd, noting the impact on each face, each individual who would carry the memory of this day forward as a cautionary tale, a living testament to the consequences of unchecked cruelty and betrayal. The darkness began to settle over the plantation, the fading light casting long shadows that seemed to stretch from the mansion's walls to the hearts of all present. Eleanor remained at the center, unwavering, her voice and presence ensuring that the moral lesson would not be forgotten. The plantation owner, once untouchable, now stood stripped of all pretense, confronted by a town that had witnessed his downfall. The slaves, once invisible, now stood as symbols of resilience and justice, and the town, previously passive, had been transformed by the act of bearing witness, by the recognition that moral accountability is not an abstract concept, but a force that can be enacted, seen, and felt in the hearts of a community. By the time night fell, the courtyard was filled with the echo of silence and reflection. The punishment had been enacted, the lesson delivered, and the balance of power irrevocably shifted. Eleanor's presence, calm and commanding throughout, ensured that the story of this day, the public reckoning, the humiliation of the guilty, the acknowledgement of the oppressed, would endure in memory and conscience alike. The town had witnessed a moral event, a dark yet necessary spectacle, and Eleanor understood that her role as orchestrator, witness, and enforcer of justice had forever changed not only the lives of those present, but the very fabric of the plantation itself. The night fell heavily over the plantation, the moon casting a pale, cold light across the fields where so much suffering had been endured, yet so little acknowledged until that day. The air was thick with the residue of tension, of judgment, of raw emotion. Eleanor stood alone on the steps of the mansion, gazing out at the vast expanse of land that had long been a theater of cruelty, manipulation, and silent suffering. The events of the day had left the plantation forever changed. The townspeople had witnessed something they could not unsee, and the plantation owner, once a figure of untouchable authority, now existed in a world defined by shame, accountability, and a public exposure he cow. LD not manipulate or escape. Eleanor could feel the weight of what had been accomplished pressing against her chest, a mixture of relief, sorrow, and the haunting recognition that justice, while delivered, had not erased the scars left by years of cruelty. The slaves, those who had endured humiliation and oppression in silence for so long, now moved with a cautious dignity. Their eyes, once dulled by fear, now reflected a fragile hope. Eleanor had seen the moment when realization dawned in their gaze, that the world had finally seen their suffering, that their voices, though long silenced, were now part of a narrative that demanded acknowledgement. Some spoke quietly among themselves, their words laced with disbelief and relief, while others simply walked through the courtyard with heads held high, reclaiming a dignity that had been denied to them for decades. Eleanor understood that this reclamation would be a slow, deliberate process, that scars do not vanish in a single day, but she also recognized the monumental shift in their perception of themselves and the world. They were no longer invisible. They had been seen, witnessed, and, in a sense, vindicated. The townspeople began to disperse as the night deepened, each carrying the memory of the day into their homes, their conversations, their very consciousness. Eleanor observed them carefully, noting the mixture of awe, fear, guilt, and reflection on each face. Some could not stop discussing the events, the moral force of the reckoning, the shock of witnessing a man once revered reduced to shame and accountability. Others were silent, lost in the realization of their own complicity, the quiet acknowledgement that their inaction had allowed cruelty to thrive for far too long. Eleanor understood that the ripple effects of this confrontation would extend far beyond the boundaries of the plantation, seeping into the lives, choices, and consciences of everyone who had borne witness. The moral lesson of the day was undeniable, unavoidable, and it would echo for years to come. The plantation owner, now stripped of dignity and influence, lingered at the edge of the courtyard, a man undone not by physical punishment alone, but by the weight of collective moral judgment. Eleanor watched him carefully, aware that his sense of control had been shattered, that the arrogance and entitlement which had defined his life had been irrevocably exposed. There was no comfort for him in wealth or status, no shield to hide behind. The humiliation he endured was both immediate and enduring, a reminder of the consequences of cruelty and betrayal. Eleanor allowed herself a brief flicker of satisfaction. N.O.T. for the suffering itself, but for the affirmation that truth, when wielded with courage and clarity, is more powerful than deception, more enduring than fear, and more binding than any law. As the night deepened, Eleanor walked among the slaves and workers, her steps deliberate, her presence a quiet reassurance that the reckoning was complete, but that care, guidance, and leadership were still necessary. She spoke softly with those who had witnessed the public punishment, listening to their fears, their hopes, their tentative plans for a future now possible, because the fear that had once bound them had been broken. Their voices, filled with both relief and trepidation, became a symphony of cautious optimism, a fragile but tangible hope that the plantation and the town could now move toward a different moral reality. Eleanor felt a deep sense of responsibility settle over her, a recognition that while she had catalyzed change, sustaining it would require vigilance, wisdom, and the courage to act whenever injustice threatened to rise again. The shadows of the mansion stretched long across the courtyard, flickering in the light of the lanterns that had been placed for evening tasks, casting strange and haunting shapes that danced across the walls. Eleanor paused to take in the scene, the subtle movements of the people around her, the quiet murmurs, the hesitant steps of those reclaiming freedom in small, deliberate ways. The plantation itself seemed to breathe differently. Now, as if the centuries of oppression, silence, and fear had left an imprint on the land that was now being released, freed, and transformed. She felt the weight of history pressing against her, yet mingled with it was the undeniable sense that a profound shift had occurred. The balance of power had changed, the moral order recalibrated, and the shadows of cruelty had been illuminated in ways that would prevent them from returning unnoticed. Eleanor walked through the main hall of the mansion, each room now heavy with the memory of the day's events. Portraits of ancestors watched her silently, their painted eyes seeming to acknowledge both the horror and the justice of what had transpired. She understood that history had been witnessed, recorded not in ink, but in the eyes, minds, and hearts of the people present. The moral reckoning of the plantation was complete in its initial form, but Eleanor knew that the legacy of the day would continue to unfold in ways subtle and profound. The choices of the townspeople, the behaviors of the workers, the awareness of the slaves, all would carry the echo of this public confrontation forward, shaping actions, relationships, and perceptions for years to come. In the quiet of her private chambers later that evening, Eleanor allowed herself to confront the full weight of her emotions. Relief mingled with sorrow, satisfaction intertwined with the lingering ache of betrayal, and a profound sense of moral clarity emerged from the darkness. He reflected on the power of truth, the necessity of witnesses, and the extraordinary courage required to confront injustice in a world where silence had long been the only shield for cruelty. She thought of the plantation owner, humiliated and exposed, and recognized that while punishment had been enacted, the deeper consequence was the loss of his moral authority, the irreversible collapse of his identity built on deception and power. It was a lesson written not in law alone, but in the conscience of a community awakened. As the night wore on, Eleanor stepped outside again, looking toward the fields bathed in moonlight. The slaves were settling in their quarters, their movements careful, their conversations hushed, but there was a subtle shift in posture, a quiet reclaiming of dignity that had been denied for so long. She watched, noting the courage in their eyes, the tentative smiles, the small gestures of pride and ownership over their own lives. For the first time, the plantation itself seemed to breathe differently, less oppressive, more alive with possibility. Eleanor understood that change was slow, incremental, and often fragile, but she also knew that the seed had been planted, nurtured by courage, truth, and the undeniable force of public accountability. The townspeople had departed, returning to their homes with conversations and whispers that would carry the events into every corner of the community. Eleanor reflected on the moral weight of their witnessing the fact that they could not unsee the corruption and cruelty that had thrived under the illusion of respectability. She recognized that collective memory, reinforced by the experience of direct observation, was perhaps the most enduring force of justice. It would shape conversations, choices, and ethical standards, compelling a community to hold power accountable in ways that law alone could not. The legacy of the day would live not in punishment alone, but in the awareness it instilled in every heart that had observed, every mind that had processed, every conscience that had been awakened. Eleanor walked through the quiet corridors of the mansion, the echoes of her footsteps a reminder of the silence that followed a storm. The plantation owner remained a figure of disgrace, confined to the boundaries of the estate, stripped of authority and dignity. The slaves moved more freely, asserting small liberties with caution but increasing confidence, while the town itself began to adjust to the moral reality revealed in public. Eleanor understood that this was the beginning of a new era, one where silence could no longer shield cruelty, where injustice could be confronted, and where moral responsibility was a force that could not be ignored. She felt a deep sense of fulfillment, tempered by the knowledge that the emotional scars of betrayal, oppression, and cruelty could not be erased overnight. In the weeks that followed, Eleanor observed subtle changes across the plantation. Tasks were carried out with more respect, interactions carried a newfound dignity, and the moral weight of the previous abuses lingered as both caution and inspiration. The slaves began to assert small acts of autonomy, guided by the knowledge that the plantation owner's authority had been publicly dismantled, and that Eleanor's vigilance ensured accountability would continue. The town, too, carried the lessons of the public reckoning, whispering them into homes, marketplaces, and schools. Eleanor recognized that the legacy of justice was not immediate in every interaction, but it was undeniable in the shifting culture, in the attention to fairness, and in the subtle but pervasive acknowledgement that cruelty could no longer thrive in secrecy. At night, as Eleanor gazed out over the moonlit fields, she reflected on the magnitude of what had been accomplished and the profound responsibilities that remained. Justice had been enacted, yet she understood that its endurance depended on continued vigilance, moral clarity, and the courage to confront wrongdoing whenever it emerged. The plantation owner remained confined within the boundaries of public shame, the slaves continued to reclaim dignity in incremental steps, and the town carried the memory of the day as both warning and inspiration. Eleanor felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that the actions of one courageous woman had shifted the trajectory of many lives, leaving a legacy of justice, accountability, and moral awakening that could not be undone. As the first light of dawn crept across the fields, Eleanor remained standing at the edge of the plantation, her gaze steady, her resolve unwavering. She understood that while darkness and cruelty could never be entirely erased from the world, courage, truth, and moral action could illuminate paths forward, creating lasting change. The events of the past day had altered the lives of everyone who had witnessed them, and the echoes of that transformation would continue to shape the plantation, the town, and the lives of those who had long been silenced. Eleanor knew that her actions had carved a permanent mark into the moral fabric of the community, a mark that would ensure that oppression, betrayal, and cruelty could never again thrive in shadows unobserved.